I found them in the wreckage of Surveyor Delt's skiff. 14 years ago, last cold season. The skiff had come down hard in the draw below my eastern fence line. Navigation failure, they said later, though nobody from the Coalition's field office ever came out to verify it in person. They sent a 2-line transmission instead. Delt was dead on impact. The skiff was a write-off. They asked if I'd salvaged anything of value and I said no, which was technically true at the time, and I closed the channel. What I'd found in the cargo hold, through a buckled access panel I'd pried open, a fence bar because I'm not the kind of man who walks away from a crash site without checking, were 5 Dhurrak pups. Newborns, near enough. The Dhurrak don't whelp in the open, they den deep. And a nursing female won't enter a vehicle or a structure unless she trusts the handler, completely, which meant Delt had been a handler, which meant the pups were his or his charge or both. 3 of them were dead, cold, the impact, the hatch seal failure that had let the Thrushmargen's early frost in overnight. The other 2 were alive because they'd been lying on each other, and on what remained of their mother's warmth from the bedding Delt had packed around them. I stood in that hold for a moment with a fence bar in one hand and the stink of cracked fuel cells in my nose and looked at them. The living 2 were the size of a man's boot, maybe a little more. Black fur already coming in over the natal down. That early neural quill growth makes a Dhurrak pup look to the uninformed like a hedgehog crossed with a shadow. 4 legs each, 8 toes per foot, and already hooking into the bedding on reflex. Eyes sealed, mouths opening and closing. They were looking for the mother they weren't going to find. I am not a sentimental man. I want to be clear about that. I spent 19 years on frontier survey work for the Coalition's Margin Assessment Division, CHIS, which is the branch that goes into places no one else has mapped yet and figures out whether anything there is worth the trouble of claiming. The work selects for a certain temperament. You spend a lot of time alone, or nearly alone, in country that is trying to kill you in ways you haven't encountered before, and the people who thrive at it are the ones who do not catastrophize, and do not sentimentalize, and do not freeze. They assess, they decide, they move. I assessed those 2 pups for perhaps 20 seconds. Then I took off my outer jacket, wrapped them in it, tucked the bundle under my arm, and walked back up the draw to my holding. That is the whole of the sentimental origin story. I'm sorry if you wanted more. The Thrushmargen is not a hospitable piece of land. The Coalition claimed it 40-some years ago, as part of the Third Korath expansion, was mostly a paperwork exercise, designed to push the surveying boundary and give the land registry offices something to file. There were no settlements here when I arrived. There are not many now. The soil in the upper draws is rocky clay that grows 4 or 5 crops well, and everything else badly. The winters are long and the growing season is grudging. The wildlife is, as they say in the field guides, varied and robust, which is the bureaucratic way of saying that several things out here will try to eat you. I came to Korath's Edge 12 years before I found the pups. I'd put in my 19 years with the Margin Assessment Division, declined the pension posting they offered me behind a desk in Veth Station, filed a homestead claim on 400 hectares of rocky clay that nobody else wanted. I built the main structure in the first year, the equipment barn in the second, the fencing over the next 4. I grew soil root and thresh grain and kept a small herd of pack animals for the heavy work. I was by any outside measure a retired survey officer living alone on a marginal frontier claim who occasionally traded thresh grain, the nearest transit depot 40 kilometers south. I was also, by that outside measure, a man who did not require watching, which was the point. The Dhurrak pups required, for the first 3 months, almost constant attention. I learned this very quickly and with very little patience for the learning. They needed feeding every 4 hours. A hydrated protein slurry at first, from a squeeze bladder, which they took to, after some initial resistance that involved a great deal of squirming and a surprising volume of sound. Animals the size of a boot. They needed warmth. I rigged a heat lamp shelf in the main structure's utility room and put them there between feedings. They needed something to push against. The biological research I found in the Coalition's field database, which had 3 pages on Dhurrak pup development and a note saying the file was preliminary and subject to revision, Explained that the pups develop muscle tone through compression and resistance in the den's walls, and that without that resistance they develop unevenly. I substituted a crate lined with folded canvas. It worked well enough. I named them Soot and Thresh. Soot because the black fur came in first on the one who'd been on top of the pile, darker, denser, the neural quills already developing that blue-black iridescence that adult Dhurrak carry. Thresh because the other one had come in with a fawn stripe down the spine, the color of thresh grain at harvest, would fade by the time she was 6 months old, but which stuck as a name. Soot was male, Thresh was female. In the early weeks, they slept against each other in the canvas crate on the heat lamp shelf, and when I came in, for the 4-hour feeding, they would make a sound I can only describe as somewhere between a wheeze and a bark, formless and urgent and produced at a volume that, for the first 2 weeks, woke me from my bunk on the other side of the main structure every single time I managed to get to sleep. I got used to it. You get used to things. After the 3rd week, the intervals stretched to 5 hours, and then 6. And then I rigged a basic sensor on the crate that signaled my bunk unit when the sound level peaked. Meant I could sleep for legitimate stretches and still not miss a feeding. That was the first piece of engineering I did for them. It was not the last. By 6 weeks, their eyes were open. I was not prepared for this, though I should have been. The field guide mentioned it. What the field guide did not convey was the specific quality of attention that Dhurrak eyes carry from the first moment they open, which is to say, they did not open their eyes and blink and look around in the way that most young animals look around, with the unfocused openness of a creature discovering that the world exists. They opened their eyes and looked at me with the particular, unwavering attention of animals that already knew the world existed, and had been listening to it for 6 weeks, and had developed strong opinions about its primary features, of which I was apparently one. Soot looked at me for approximately 4 seconds. Then he put his head down and went back to sleep. Thresh watched me for the entire feeding. I won't say it was unsettling, exactly. I've sat across from apex predators in the field and had them assess me, and I know what that looks like in a creature that views you as a potential meal or a potential threat. This was not that. This was something I didn't have a good category for yet, which is the quality of regard from an animal that has already classified you and is now simply keeping track. I was not a threat, and I was not prey, and I was not an irrelevance. I was, from the evidence of those amber eyes watching my every movement, without alarm, without hunger, without any of the registers I expected. I was something else. Something that the 6-week-old Dhurrak nervous system had a name for that I was only beginning to understand. I filed it away and made a note to read more carefully whatever I could find on Dhurrak social cognition. Turned out to be very little. The field database was thin on that subject. I would, in the end, learn most of what I needed to know from direct observation, which is also how I learned most things worth knowing in 19 years of frontier survey work, so this was not a surprise. The field database's 3 pages on Dhurrak pup development did not say much about what happened after the year. I later found out that this was because almost no one raised Dhurrak from pups outside of a licensed specialist program, and the coalition's specialist programs did not put their methodology into open files. What I knew from survey work was that adult Dhurrak were pack predators on 3 Korath-adjacent worlds, that they were used occasionally by frontier enforcement units as trail hounds and close-range support animals, and that they were territorial, bonded in pairs or small family groups, and had what the field guides diplomatically described as a significant protective response to perceived threats against pack members. What the field guides did not say, because they were written by people who had observed Dhurrak from a professional distance, and not by people who had raised them, is what it is like to be the anchor point of a Dhurrak pair's concept of pack. It is not like owning an animal. I want to be precise about this because people ask me about it sometimes. Usually people who've seen Soot and Thresh at a distance and assumed some professional handling was involved. There is no professional handling in a Dhurrak bond. The bond is not a training artifact. It is not a conditioned response. It is something older and more fundamental than either of those things, and it runs in both directions. What it felt like, practically, The first 2 years was this. Wherever I went on the holding, I was followed. Not underfoot. Dhurrak pups learn spatial awareness fast, and they learn to read human movement fast far than that, but close. Always within range of a sprint. If I went to the equipment barn, they went to the equipment barn. If I sat down to eat, they settled at the edge of the room and faced the door. If I woke in the night to check a fence alarm, I opened the door to find them already on their feet, already oriented toward whatever had triggered the alarm, before I'd made a sound. They were not protecting me from the alarm. They were protecting the pack from whatever had triggered it. I was the pack. Fence alarm nights are the thing I remember most clearly from those first 2 years. The Thresh Margin's backcountry puts a varied predator load on any holding that doesn't maintain a hard perimeter. I had the fencing, which helped, but the backcountry's larger animals could push through wire given a reason. The fence alarm network I installed in year 2 of the holding notified my bunk unit via sensor whenever something in the 100-kilogram above range pressed against the east or north lines. On a bad cold season night, this could happen 2 or 3 times before dawn. The first time it happened after Soot and Thresh were old enough to move freely in the main structure. They were perhaps 5 months old, still small enough to look almost manageable. I got out of the bunk at 3 in the morning and found them both standing at the exterior door, not barking, not distressed, standing oriented toward the north fence line. Thresh had her muzzle an inch from the door seam, reading whatever came through the gap, and Soot was half a step back and to her left, which I would come to recognize as their default positioning in any situation of uncertainty. Thresh reads, Soot flanks. I pulled on my jacket and opened the door and went out to check the line with a lamp. They came with me. They stayed at my heels on the way out, and when we reached the section of fence that was showing the alarm, they fanned out without instruction and moved along the fence in opposite directions. Soot east, Thresh west, and whatever had been pressing on the line had gone. We went back to the main structure. They came inside and settled in the utility room, and I went back to the bunk. I thought about that arrangement for a long time afterward. They had been 5 months old. I had not given them any instruction. They had simply known, in the way that something fundamental knows itself, what the proper response to a fence alarm was, which was, go with the pack, assess the line, return. The next time the alarm triggered, 2 nights later we did the same thing. The time after that, the same. By the end of that first cold season, it had become as fixed and unspoken as any other element of the holding's routine, and I had stopped being surprised by it, which I think says more about the adaptability of a frontier survey officer's expectations than it does about anything remarkable in what we were doing. We were 3 creatures living on a shared piece of land, watching the same fence line, dealing with the same backcountry. The arrangement made sense. It still does. I thought about that a good deal during those first 2 years. I am not given to dwelling on things. This struck me as worth the time. I had raised them. I had kept them alive when they should have died in that cracked hold. But the Dhurrak don't bond out of gratitude. Or if they do, gratitude is only the door, not the room behind it. What Soot and Thresh were doing, as I understood it from the 3 pages of field data I had, and from the growing accumulation of direct observation, treating me as the alpha of their pack. Not because I was larger than them, not because I was louder or faster or more dangerous, but because I was the one who had made decisions when decisions needed making. And the decisions had kept them alive. And in Dhurrak terms, that is what an alpha is. The one whose judgment you trust with your life. They were not wrong, exactly. It was a weight I hadn't asked for. By the time they were 2 years old, Soot and Thresh were each the size of a large pack animal. The neural quills had come in fully, dense, matted-looking until they moved, and then you could see the structure beneath. Each quill a sensory organ capable of reading air pressure changes, vibration, chemical trace, electromagnetic shift. Their pack eyes had settled into that amber that Dhurrak carry all their lives, with the lateral pupil that gives them better peripheral field than a human, by a factor the field guide called significant, and I called unnerving. First time, Thresh tracked a bird's flight over my left shoulder without moving her head. Shh. I expanded the equipment barn that winter to give them sleeping space, though they still preferred the utility room during the cold season, which meant that I spent several months navigating around two animals the size of draft animals in order to get to my tools. I did not complain about this to anyone, because there was no one to complain to. I adjusted. The holding's rhythm built itself around 3 presences, instead of 1. I woke and they were already awake, or already aware, which is not quite the same thing in Dhurrak terms because they have a resting state that is not quite sleep. A low alert processing that uses the neural quill net to keep reading the territory while the rest of the animal is still. I did the morning's equipment checks, and they moved with me through the barn. Not supervising but simply present, the way a veteran survey partner is present. Not in your way, not demanding attention, there and trackable at the edge of your awareness, so that you know, without looking, that the line is intact. I ate and they watched the door. I repaired fence, and one of them was always at the edge of the work, the other ranging out along the line checking 50 meters ahead. We did not speak much. I am aware this sounds like an understatement with respect to animals that do not have language. What I mean is that the holding operated at a low level of verbal exchange, even when I talked to them, which I did. A word when I set down the feed, a word when we reached the gate on the fence checks, a word at the end of the day when the equipment was stored, and the barn doors closed and we went inside. Not commands, not instructions, simply the acknowledgement that we were in the same space and the day had gone all right, which is all most partnerships ever really require. I did not think of it as contentment, exactly. I am suspicious of that word in the context of frontier work, which has a way of turning contentment into complacency, if you let it. I thought of it as function. The holding was functioning, the pack was functioning, the arithmetic worked. By 4 years, they were full grown. The field guide's 3 pages had been updated once in the years since I'd last checked. The update included a size range table that soot and thresh exceeded at the upper end. Soot massed 240 kilograms on the equipment barn scale, which I checked out of curiosity one autumn, and which gave me a number I sat with for a while before accepting it. Thresh was somewhat lighter, 210, but she was faster, and her quill extension reflex was sharper. And in the 14 years I have spent with them, I have never once seen her make an imprecise movement. The specialist programs, the updated file noted, rarely raised Dhurrak to this mass because the bonding intensity at full size in a pair raised together was outside standard, operational parameters. I did not know exactly what that meant in practice. I suspected I was finding out. What I knew in practice was this. Nothing came onto my holding without Soot and Thresh knowing about it before I did. Not predators from the back country. The territory marking Dhurrak runs 3 kilometers in every direction from a denning site, and nothing with functional threat recognition will cross a fresh Dhurrak mark. Not the occasional transit depot trader who came out with supplies. Not the Survey Commission's 2-person team that rode out to renew my land registration in year 3, who arrived to find an amber-eyed pair of adult Dhurrak sitting at my gate and declined to exit their vehicle until I walked out and told Soot and to stand down, which they did because I asked, and because the traders and the commission team represented no threat to me. That last part is important to understand. Soot and Thresh did not threaten the traders or the commission team. They did not lunge or growl, display the quill erect posture that means, in Dhurrak body language, that the next action is force. They simply sat and watched. They were not aggressive. They were attentive. There is a difference, and most people, when they see 2 adult Dhurrak watching them from a gate, do not stop to appreciate it. The rumors about Vordathi land pressure on Korath's Edge started reaching me through the transit depot trader about 2 years before the crew arrived. The Vordathi are a legitimate coalition-registered enterprise. Commercial land development and resource extraction primarily, with a long history on the frontier margins. They buy distressed claims, they file consolidation petitions, they apply extraction permits. It is all legal. They are not, in the strict technical sense, a predatory operation. In the practical sense, which is the sense that matters to a man sitting on 400 hectares of rocky clay that happens to sit above what the Survey Commission's updated geological maps now showed as a viable thresh mineral seam. They are exactly what the word suggests. 3 claims on the Thresh margin had transferred to Vordathi ownership in the 18 months before the crew came to my gate. The first 2 had been willing sales. Small holders who were tired and ready to be done, which I understood, which I did not judge. The third had involved an eviction proceeding that the claim holder had contested and lost because the Vordathi's legal team had found a registration gap in his original filing, and the coalition's land court had ruled accordingly. I had no registration gaps. I had filed clean in year 1, renewed clean every 3 years since, and kept copies of everything in a fire-rated case in the main structure. I was not worried about the legal mechanism. I was also not naive about the methods that precede the legal mechanism, which are the methods that make the legal mechanism unnecessary. Because by the time the papers are filed, the holder has already been persuaded to sign. I checked my line twice in the month before the crew arrived. I made sure the gate latch was in good repair. I told Soot and Thresh nothing, because there was nothing to tell. They had been watching the margins of the holding for 14 years. They did not need instructions. The crew arrived on a clear morning in the early part of the cold season in a Vordathi commercial transit hauler with the company sigil on the door panel. They came up the access track from the south and stopped at my gate. There were 4 of them. The driver was also one of the enforcement detail. I could tell from the way he dismounted, was careful and positioned. He put the hauler between himself and the gate before he came around the front, and he stood with his right side slightly angled. The other 2 enforcement deterrent personnel came out of the rear compartment, and they were the kind of large that is not accidental. Contract enforcement for a Vordathi land crew, which means former coalition security or frontier militia, the type you hire when you expect the persuasion to require a physical component, both carrying prod-batons on their belts, both looking at the holding with the professional assessment that said they had done this before and did not expect complications. The 4th man was the factor Hessek. I found out his name from the documents he handed me later, though by then names were something of an afterthought. He was mid-50s, well-dressed in the Vordathi corporate style, which runs to dark utilitarian cloth and silver-threaded trim, a way of looking expensive. That is also a way of looking serious, and he carried himself with the particular confidence of a man who has legal papers in a portfolio under his arm and considers that to be conclusive. He had a voice that projected. He used it to project across my gate before the latch was fully open. Cullen Vost, registered holder. Claim designation Korath 7714. He already knew the answer. It was not a question in any real sense. I'm Factor Hessek, representing Vordathi Consolidated Margin Development, here to serve a formal notice of acquisition interest and to discuss the terms of a voluntary transfer. He held up the portfolio. This is fully registered. You can verify the Coalition Land Court seal. I had come out of the main structure when I heard the hauler on the access track. I'd taken my time, put on my jacket, filled a cup of water from the tap, drank about half of it. I walked to the gate at my normal pace, which is not a fast pace, and I stood on my side of the latch and looked at the 4 of them. I know what Vordathi Consolidated does, I said. Then you know this is a standard. I know what it is. Hessek paused. He was a man accustomed to managing conversations, and I had interrupted him in a way that did not signal hostility or fear, which was not the register he was prepared for. He recalibrated. Then you'll want to look at our offer. The terms are very reasonable, Mr. Vaste. We're prepared to open the gate. One of the enforcement details said. He was the larger of the 2, and he said it the way large men who carry prod-batons say most things, as though the statement were a courtesy being extended, and the alternative to the courtesy was already in his hand. His name, I found out later, Drev. It said so on his employment documentation, which Hessek was carrying in the portfolio along with everything else, in the event I wanted to contest the conduct of any member of the crew. This is a detail I found darkly funny afterward. In a moment, I said. I opened the gate. They came through in the order I'd expect. Hessek first, maintaining the professional face, the driver angling left, and the other enforcement man coming through side by side, which was a mistake tactically but which they didn't know was a mistake yet. What they had not done, in the time between their arrival at the gate and the opening of it, was, "Look at the equipment barn." Shh. The barn is 40 meters from the gate, set back to the east of the main structure. Shh. It is a large building. I built it with room to work on heavy machinery and to store the season's equipment out of the weather. And over the years I'd added the sleeping space for Soot and Thresh along the entire north wall. The barn doors were open, as they usually are on a clear morning. The interior was from the gate, shadowed. Soot and Thresh were in the barn. They did not come out when Hesek spoke. They did not come out when Drev told me to open the gate. They came out when the 4 men walked through, 'cause that was when the pack had entered the holdings ground, and Dhurrak do not stay in the barn when the pack's ground has been entered by strangers. I heard Thresh first. Not a sound exactly, more the absence of the ambient barn noise that I'd stopped consciously noticing years ago and which my hindbrain still registered. Then Soot, emerging into the clear morning light on the left side of the barn door, and Thresh on the right. I watched the 4 men see them. Hesek was facing me with the portfolio open and a form half extended. He registered the change in the expressions of his enforcement detail before he registered the cause, and he turned. He was quiet for a moment. Then, "Those are Dhurrak." "Yes," I said. "Those are adult Dhurrak. They are." He looked at them. Soot standing on the left, Thresh standing on the right, both of them fully stopped, fully oriented, quills rising slowly into the high attention position that is not yet threat display, but is no longer neutral. Their amber eyes were moving in a slow, methodical pattern I'd seen on the fence alarm nights. Thresh read Hesek, then the driver, then back to Hesek. Soot was already fixed on Dhurrak, who had his weight on his back foot and his hand moving toward his belt. Soot's quills tracked the movement the way a compass needle tracks north. "They shouldn't be here. This isn't a licensed specialist facility." "No," I said, "it isn't. The Coalition's animal handling regulations for Class 4 predators require. I'm aware of the regulations." The larger enforcement man, Drev, had his hand on his prod-baton, not drawing it. His hand was resting on it, the way a hand rests on something when the man attached to it is deciding. He was looking at Soot, who was looking at him in the specific Dhurrak way that is not a snarl, not a lunge, not any of the things that most people associate with danger. It is stillness. Complete, absolute stillness, with the amber eyes fully open and the quills at 3/4 extension, and the weight shifted very slightly onto the hind quarters. Thresh was doing the same thing to Drev's colleague, whose name I never got. "You need to call them off," Drev said. He had not drawn the prod-baton. He was being careful, which was smart, and it was also not going to help him. "They're not on," I said. "What?" "They're not doing anything. They're standing in their barn doorway on their ground." I looked at Hesek. "Finish what you were saying." Hesek had the face of a man who had prepared for several versions of this conversation, and was discovering that the version he was in now had not been in his preparation. He pressed forward, because he was a professional, and because the papers in his portfolio were real and he believed in them. "Mr. Vaste, I'm required to inform you that Vordathi Consolidated has identified a viable thresh mineral seam beneath land parcels designated Korath 7714 through Korath 77 Waitit. Your parcel is central to the extraction footprint we are." "I know about the seam," I said. "Commission updated the geological file 2 years ago. I've read it." This was not the response he expected. He adjusted again. "Then you understand the value." "I understand the value. I also understand that the seam is on my land, and I filed clean, and my registration is current, and there are no gaps in my documentation. So whatever mechanism you're planning to use to persuade me to sign, it isn't a legal one." I looked at Drev. "That's what the prod-batons are for." Nobody said anything for a moment. The clear morning was very quiet. The only movement in the yard was the slow, almost imperceptible rise and fall of Soot's quills as he continued reading Drev. "Been on the frontier margins for 31 years, I said. "I've met 3 Vordathi land crews. The papers are always real. Persuasion method is always the same." Hesek put the portfolio down, slowly. He was recalibrating in real time, and he was doing it well. I'll give him that. He was not a stupid man. He was a man in a position that had just changed significantly from what he'd expected. "Mr. Vaste, I assure you that Vordathi Consolidated's interest is in a clean voluntary." Drev drew the prod-baton. I don't know what he intended. Possibly he intended to make a point. to introduce a physical argument into a conversation that was going the wrong direction. Possibly he intended to use it. What he definitely did not intend was for the act of drawing it to be the act that ended the morning's enterprise. But that was what it was. Soot moved. A Dhurrak at full sprint over flat ground covers approximately 60 meters in 5 seconds. The barn doorway to the gate was 40 meters. Soot covered it in something less than 4. I did not time it. I observed it. And what I observed was a 240-kilogram predator that had been raised from a pup, the size of a boot, arriving at the enforcement grade body of Drev with a specificity and control that was not compatible with the common misunderstanding of Dhurrak as blunt instruments. It did not bowl him over. He hit Drev's weapon arm, the forearm, 2-pod strike, which from a Dhurrak at that mass is enough to rotate the arm in the shoulder socket in a way that makes the prod-baton fall and the man holding it make a sound that is not quite a scream. Drev was on the ground. The prod-baton was in the dirt. Thresh had not moved. She was still in the barn doorway, watching the other enforcement man who had not drawn his baton and who had taken 2 steps backward and who appeared to be making a very rapid internal assessment of the situation. His face had the look of a man arriving at a conclusion he did not want but could not argue with. The driver had retreated to the gate and stopped there. Hessek was standing completely still. I picked up the prod-baton. I turned it off. It had apparently been cycling on in anticipation of use, and put it in the pocket of my jacket. "Suit," I said, stepped off Drev and sat back. He was not breathing hard. His quills were at full extension, which is threat display, but he was sitting and he was looking at me, and the threat display was information, not action. It said, "The threat is down, the pack is intact. What next?" Drev was on the ground holding his arm with his other hand. He was not badly hurt. A Dhurrak strike to the forearm is not a bite, is not a maiming blow. It is a restraint action, the way a senior pack member restrains a junior who has done something reckless. Drev would have a significant bruise and a shoulder that ached for 2 weeks. He was functional. He was simply no longer a man who had a prod-baton or an inclination to use one. "Now," I said to Hessek, "is there more you need to tell me about the acquisition papers, or have we covered the main points?" Hessek looked at the papers. He looked at Soot. He looked at me. I will say, for the record, that in that moment he had the expression of a man arriving at a truth he had not expected and did not particularly welcome. "You knew we were coming," he said. "I knew someone was coming," I said. "The Thresh Margin is a small community, and the Vordathi crew that served the Keleth claim did not leave quietly. If you'd simply, I'd like you to help Drev up, gather your papers, and leave the holding," I said. "You can verify my registration with the land court on your own time. You'll find it's clean." I looked at him a moment longer. "You're welcome to file a report on the Dhurrak. The Coalition's Class 4 handling regulations are a matter of record, and I expect the regional office will send someone to inspect the facility. Eventually, when they do, they'll find 2 adult Dhurrak who have never injured a civilian. Territory marking has maintained a predator-free margin on my land, and the neighboring claims for 14 years, and whose licensing status I expect to be able to regularize without difficulty." This was partly true. I had, in fact, filed a retroactive specialist handling inquiry with the regional office the previous month, on the advice of the transit depot trader, who knew a land affairs counsel in Veth Station. The inquiry was pending. I had reason to believe it would go through, though the regional office had expressed, in its acknowledgement letter, what it called some procedural surprise at the timeline involved. "And the other," I said, "I'd like you to leave." He left. They all left. Drev walked with his arm held close to his body and did not look at Soot as he passed. The second enforcement man had already exited through the gate. The driver was in the hauler. Hessek walked through the gate last with the portfolio under his arm, and Hast stopped once and turned back. "You understand," he said, "that this doesn't close the matter. Vordathi's interest in the seam is ongoing," I said. "I understand. So is my registration." He left. I stood in the yard until the hauler had gone back down the access track and out of sight on the south road. Sat beside me on my left, quills settling slowly from full extension back to neutral. Thresh had come out of the barn and was on my right. The 3 of us stood in the cold season morning, and listened to the hauler's engine noise fade into the backcountry quiet. A wind came off the eastern hills, carrying the dry smell of the thresh grain rows. Nothing else moved. Then I went inside and made a second cup of water and drank it standing at the window, looking at the eastern fence line, and Thresh came in after me. Thresh lay down in the utility room doorway, which is where she has always preferred to sleep when the cold season comes. Soot sat in the main room and looked at me with those amber eyes, the way he has looked at me for 14 years, which is to say, attentively, calmly. The quality of attention that is not waiting for instructions, but simply keeping track of whether the pack is intact, and the holding is clear. The holding was intact, the pack was clear. I sat down in my chair and acknowledged this. What I've been asked, in the time since, by the Land Affairs Council, by the 2 regional office officials who came out 3 months later to inspect the facility and left with a written assessment that I still have somewhere in the fire-rated case, by the transit depot trader who has a gift for asking personal questions while appearing to be talking about something else, is whether I was afraid, whether I thought, when Drev drew the prod-baton, that things might go badly, whether it occurred to me, standing between a Vordathi enforcement crew and the 2 largest Dhurrak on Korath's edge, that I was an old man who had made an enormous assumption about what 14 years of ration scraps and rough hands and cold season sleeping space, fence alarm checks in the middle of the night would mean when it mattered. I'll tell you what I told the Land Affairs Council, which is the honest answer. I didn't think about it in those terms. When Drev's hand went to the baton, I did not calculate, did not assess the odds or run a decision tree. I had not, if I'm being precise, been particularly worried about the crew since they came through the gate, because I had lived with Soot and Thresh for 14 years and I knew, in the way you know things that have been proven to you repeatedly over a long span of time, what they would do. Question people actually want answered when they ask if I was afraid is, did I trust them? Did I trust 2 animals, however large, however bonded, to make the right call in a situation with 4 armed men and consequences attached? The answer is yes, unreservedly, not because I trained them, not because I ran them through handling protocols, or installed behavioral conditioning, or applied any of the methods that the specialist programs use, which I know about now from the regional office's inspector, who is a thorough man, and who spent 3 hours on my holding and left, I think, with more respect for what had happened here than his report quite captured. I trusted them because I knew them, and because what Soot had done when Drev drew the prod-baton was not a trained response. It was a pack decision. Drev had introduced a weapon into the pack's ground in a manner that indicated immediate threat to the alpha, and Soot had removed the weapon from the equation with the minimum force required to do so. That is not training. That is judgment. And you don't trust judgment because you installed it. You trust it because you've watched it operate over 14 years, in every small and large circumstance the holding presents. The fence alarm nights, the traders at the gate, the commission team in their vehicle, the backcountry predator that pressed the north line 3 winters running until it understood the marking and stopped, and it has never once been wrong. I think about the 3 pups that died in the hold. I think about them sometimes in the cold season, when the wind comes off the backcountry and Soot and Thresh are in the utility room, and the holding is quiet and I am sitting in the main room with the lamp on. I think about the weight of them when I carried them up the draw, the warmth coming through the jacket fabric. I don't think of it as a choice I made, exactly. A choice implies a set of alternatives that I consciously weighed. I didn't weigh anything. I saw them, and I picked them up. I don't know what the licensed specialist programs would have made of any of this. I don't know whether Soot and Thresh, raised in a facility, with proper protocols and behavioral conditioning, done better or worse, or simply differently, on that clear morning when the Vordathi hauler came up the access track. It is a pointless thing to wonder about, so I generally stop. What I know is what actually happened, which is enough. Factor Hesse's report was filed 6 weeks late. I know this because the Land Affairs Council, who had by that point developed a professional interest in the case, obtained a copy through a disclosure request. It was a thorough document, heavily qualified, and it contained a phrase in the incident notations section that the council found amusing enough to read to me twice over a channel call. HFY had written, "Claim holder maintains what appear to be two fully mortgage class 4 Dhurrak in a non-standard but apparently stable pack bond configuration with the holder as primary attachment figure. The animals demonstrated targeted and non-excessive intervention in response to perceived threat against the holder, consistent with pack protective behavior at the apex bonded level. Further attempts to advance acquisition negotiations on Korath 77 Warren are assessed as carrying elevated operational risk until the holding's predator situation is more fully understood." The council liked elevated operational risk. She used it as a category header in the filing she submitted to the land court on my behalf, contesting the acquisition's interest notice on the grounds of procedural irregularity in the enforcement conduct. The land court agreed, and the notice was voided. More than the voiding, though, which was satisfying, don't misunderstand me. What stayed with me was the phrase HFY had used for suit and thresh, apex bonded level. He'd meant it as a technical assessment. He'd been describing the mechanism that made further visits impractical. What he'd described, meaning to, was what I had known for 11 of the 14 years since I'd carried two boot-sized pups up from the crash draw in my jacket. That soot and thresh did not protect me because they were animals, and I was their keeper. They protected me because I was the pack, and the pack was theirs, and there was no force on Korath's edge or beyond it that they would allow to change that. I am 63 years old. I have 19 years of frontier survey work and 12 years on this holding before the pups arrived, and the sum of all of it is a man who is not given to declarations. But I'll say this once because it seems to want saying. I found them in the wreckage of a crashed skiff on a cold morning, 2 of them left out of 5. Too small to see and too stubborn to die. I kept them alive with hydrated protein slurry and a heat lamp shelf and canvas walls for their paws to push against. Checks the fence alarms with them in the dark of 3 in the morning for 14 winters. I watched them grow from boot size to larger than anything else on the margin. I never asked them to protect me. That was never the arrangement. The arrangement was simpler and older than anything the Coalition's specialist programs have ever managed to put into a 3-page field database. Entry. I fed them, and I kept them warm, and I made decisions when decisions needed making and lived with the outcomes, and I asked nothing from them that was not freely given. They decided the rest. 14 years ago and every morning since. The regional office finalized my specialist handling registration 4 months after the Vordathi crew's visit. It came through with a classification I had not anticipated. Apex bonded pair, non-institutional, Korath's edge designation, registered to Colin Vast, claim Korath, 774. The inspector's notes, which were attached as supplementary documentation, contained a single sentence I haven't been able to argue with. The bond observed between the holder and the subject, Dhurrak pair, is of a depth and stability consistent with a 14-year primary pack configuration. The holder is advised that, in the event of attempted interference with his person or property, the Dhurrak will respond proportionally to threat level as assessed by the pack. No further behavioral intervention is recommended. No further behavioral intervention is recommended. That is, I think, the most accurate thing the Coalition's offices have ever said about me or mine. Soot is at my left heel as I write this. Thresh is in the doorway, watching the southern track, because it is late afternoon and the light comes from the south in the late cold seasons, and she has always liked to watch it. They are 14.5 years old. In Dhurrak terms, they are at full maturity, which the updated field guide now estimates as the beginning of a 30 to 35 year adult prime phase. I have done the arithmetic and it comes out in their favor. The holding is intact, the pack is clear, the Vordathi haven't been back. I wouldn't expect them.